Nobody at the courthouse could figure why the girl kept her hand up. The auctioneer had already moved past the parcel twice, calling it the way you call a name at a funeral, out of obligation and not hope. And the men along the back wall had gone back to talking hogs and diesel prices. 60 acres of Choteau bottomland out past the Vermilion cutoff, flooded 11 months of the 12, good for frogs and mosquitoes, and nothing a man could put a plow to. And here was this girl with rain-colored eyes and a canvas coat 2 sizes too big, holding her arms straight up like she was answering a question in school. $1 an acre, the auctioneer said again, almost apologizing for the words as they left his mouth. $60 for the whole worthless mess, going once. And a man near the coffee urn laughed the kind of laugh that isn't cruel so much as certain, and said loud enough to carry, "That ground's been drowning families for 50 years, honey. You're just the newest one signing up." She did not turn to look at him. She kept her hand up until the gavel came down, and then she lowered it slow, the way you set down something you've been carrying a long while, and she went to the little folding table to sign her name. Wren Callahan, she wrote, in a hand that pressed hard enough to dent the carbon copy underneath. And she counted out the dollars from a coffee can she'd brought, and she did not explain herself to anyone. If you're the kind of person who's ever been told that what you have isn't worth much, do me a favor before we go on. Tap that like button, and tell me down in the comments what town you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one of them, and I like knowing where these stories land. Now let me take you back to how a 19-year-old with $60 and no plan ended up owning the one piece of Corvo County nobody else in 3 generations had wanted. She had come back in the spring, which is to say she'd come back the way water comes back to a low place, not by choosing so much as by there being nowhere else downhill to go. Her mother had died in February in a city 400 miles east, and there had been an apartment to empty and a job at a laundry to quit, and nothing after that. No reason to stay and no reason not to leave, and so Wren had put what she owned in the bed of a truck that ran on faith and driven west into country she'd only seen as a small child, back to the farmhouse that belonged now to her great-aunt O'Dallas, who was the last of that side and who had written exactly 1 line on the back of the funeral card. "Come here if you got nowhere else," it said, and that was O'Dallas entire, a woman who spent words like they were the last dry matches in a wet camp. The farmhouse sat on a rise above the Choteau bottoms on a gravel spur called Perot Road, white paint gone to the color of an old tooth, and O'Dallas had lived there alone since her husband Emil went into the ground 11 years back, and she farmed almost nothing anymore but a garden and a dozen brown hens and a memory as long as the river. Wren was not what you'd call a talker either, which was maybe why the 2 of them fit under one roof without friction. She was observant in a way that made older folks uneasy, because she'd study a thing a long moment before she touched it, and she kept a spiral notebook in her coat pocket that she wrote in without letting on what she was writing. She'd been in the county a month before she ever walked down into the bottoms proper, and when she did, she went alone, on a gray morning after a rain, her boots pulling at the muck with a sound like the ground was reluctant to let her go. What she found down there was not nothing. Though everyone had agreed for 50 years it was nothing, she found standing water in sheets between the cottonwoods, and cattail and arrowhead crowding the shallows, and a smell coming off the black mud that was not rot exactly, but something older and greener than rot, the smell of a place that had been making itself richer every year that a man cursed it for being too wet to use. She stood at the edge of it a long time. She did not go in. She wrote something in the notebook and walked back up to the house, and she did not tell O'Dallas where she'd been, though the old woman looked at her boots and knew. The bottoms had drowned the Callahans, everyone said, and it was more or less true. Emil's father had bought that ground cheap in the 20s, thinking he'd drain it, and the river had taught him otherwise, and his son Emil had tried the same, and the river had taught him the same lesson twice as hard. And by the time Emil died, the family had learned to speak of the Bottoms the way you speak of a relative who did time, quietly and with a change of subject ready. When the county put the last parcel up for back taxes that autumn, the whole thing was a formality. Nobody bids on drowned ground. Nobody but a girl who'd been staring at black mud for 3 months and writing in a notebook, and who had, though she told no one yet, begun to suspect that the thing everyone called a curse might only be a resource waiting for somebody patient enough to stop fighting it. The seed of it, if you want to call it a seed, came from Odalis, and it came the way most of what Odalis gave you came, sideways and without any bow tied on it. It was an evening in late October, and they were shelling the last of the beans at the kitchen table with the radio off, and Wren had asked, careful, what Emil had grown down in the wet years before he gave up. Odalis did not answer right away. She worked 3 pods clean and dropped the beans in the bowl, and then she said, without looking up, that Emil hadn't grown anything down there, that the mistake all of them had made, her husband and his father both, was thinking the ground owed them a crop. The ground down there doesn't want to be a field, she said. It wants to be what it is. And then she said the thing Wren would write down that night and underline twice and carry around in her chest for the next 4 years. The thing that would become the whole spine of what came after. Emil used to say the water isn't the problem. The water is the harvest. Nobody ever figured out how to bring it in. And then she got up and put the kettle on, and that was the end of the talking, because Odalis had said what she meant and saw no reason to say it twice. Wren did not sleep much that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the room that had been her mother's as a girl, and she turned that sentence over and over. The water is the harvest. She did not know yet what it meant, but she knew the way you know weather in your knees, that it meant something, that Emil had seen the edge of an idea and died before he could walk out onto it. She spent that winter in the county library 40 minutes east in the town of Beaudry, reading whatever she could find that touched on wet ground and what grows in it. And she filled 2 more notebooks, and she was quiet at the feed store on Saturdays, where the men who'd laughed at the auction had already half forgotten her. And she watched, and she listened, and she waited for the ground to thaw. What she'd landed on by the time the ice went out of the sloughs in March was a plant most of those men would have called a weed if they'd noticed it at all. Watercress and wild rice, and a dozen other things that the standing water of the Choteau bottoms grew better than any drained field in the county could dream of. Because the thing that had beaten her family for 50 years, the thing they'd cursed and fought and finally surrendered to, was the very thing certain crops loved more than sunlight. She started small because she had no money to start any other way, and because small was, though she wouldn't have used the word, the whole philosophy of it. She waded into the shallowest of the sloughs that first April in Emil's old hip boots that came up to her ribs, and she found where the watercress already grew wild in the spring-fed pockets, dark green and peppery and thick, and she gathered a basketful and carried it up to the house and washed it 3 times in the kitchen sink. She ate some. It was better than anything she'd bought in a store in her life, sharp and clean and tasting of the cold water it came from. Then she did the thing that would have made every man at that auction shake his head, which is to say she did almost nothing, only paid attention. She figured out which pockets ran spring-fed and cold all summer and which went stagnant, because watercress wants moving water, and she marked them in the notebook. She figured out how to cut it so it grew back thicker. She learned by wading and watching and getting the muck sucked into her boots, and once losing a boot entirely and walking home half barefoot, and Odalis watched her come up the hill filthy and said only, "That ground finally got somebody stubborn enough for it," which from Odalis was very nearly a parade. The first money she ever made off the drowned ground was $4, and it came in June. She'd tied her cress in bunches with kitchen twine, washed and crisp and wrapped in a wet cloth, and she'd driven the faithless truck into Beaudry to the little grocery that a man named Ferris Lemoyne ran on the square, and she'd set the bunches on his counter and asked would he try selling them. Ferris was a heavy-set man with a soft voice and an eye for anything he could sell as local, because the summer people from the lake would pay double for local, and he looked at the crease a long moment and picked up a bunch and smelled it and said, "Where'd this come from?" "The Callahan Bottoms," she told him, and he laughed, not unkind, and said, "There's nothing in the Callahan Bottoms but bad luck and cattails." And she said, "There's this," and she didn't say anything else. He took 8 bunches on consignment and gave her $4 for the first 2 out of his own pocket to be sporting. And by the weekend all 8 had sold, and a woman from the lake had asked when there'd be more. That was the first small proof, and it was small enough that nobody noticed it but Wren and Ferris and the woman from the lake. And Wren noted it in the book with the date and the amount and no comment, because she'd already learned from Odalis that a thing you're sure of doesn't need decorating. Word did not travel fast, because nothing in Corriveau County travels fast, but it traveled. By August, Ferris was taking 3 dozen bunches a week and selling out by Saturday noon, and he'd started telling the lake people the story, the girl and the drowned ground, because a story sells produce better than a low price does, and people who'd bought the crease once came back for it and brought friends. Wren widened her cutting slowly, always slowly, never taking more than a pocket could regrow, moving through the sloughs on a rotation she kept in the notebook so that no patch was ever cut twice in the same fortnight. She was making, by the end of that first summer, something like $60 in a good week, which does not sound like much and was, to a girl who'd counted out the price of the land in $1 bills from a coffee can, an amount that felt like the ground had finally turned over in its sleep and started paying rent. She banked most of it. She bought a second pair of hip boots and a proper harvest knife and a big galvanized tub for washing, and she bought Odalis a new radio, and the rest she left alone, because she'd already decided without quite deciding it that she was not going to borrow against this ground, not ever, that whatever it became, it would become the way the mud had become rich, slow, and on its own terms. The men at the feed store found out about it in the way men at feed stores find out about everything, which is imperfectly and after the fact and mostly wrong. There was a man named Delmar Boone who farmed 800 dry acres north of the county road and who had a large opinion of his own good sense, and it was Delmar who'd laughed the certain laugh at the auction. And it was Delmar who took it upon himself one Saturday morning over coffee at the feed store to render the official verdict on the Callahan girl and her weeds. He'd heard she was selling swamp grass to the lake people, he said, and folks had chuckled, and he'd leaned back and delivered the sentence that Wren, had she heard it, would have written in the notebook and underlined, because it was exactly the thesis that the next several years were going to spend themselves disproving. Picking weeds out of a mud hole isn't farming, and it isn't a business, Delmar said. It's a girl playing in the crick till she gets tired of it. That ground's got no future, and neither does whatever she thinks she's doing down in it. You cannot build anything on water. And the men had nodded, because it was the kind of thing that sounds like wisdom when a confident man says it slow. And the subject had changed to the price of corn, and nobody in that room, least of all Delmar Boone, had any notion that they'd just witnessed the high water mark of their own certainty. Wren heard about it eventually, the way you hear about such things, from the teenager who bagged groceries at Ferris's store, a lanky kid named Tobin Arsenault, who'd taken to helping her wash and bunch on Saturday mornings for a cut of the money and the pleasure of being part of something the grown men didn't understand. Tobin told her what Delmar had said, expecting her to be angry, and she wasn't. She washed a bunch of cress and shook the water off it and set it in the tub and said, mild as milk, that Delmar was right, you can't build anything on water. Then she looked at the cress a long moment in that way she had, and she said, but you can grow something in it. And Tobin didn't understand what she meant then and would understand it completely inside of 2 years. She went back to her washing. That was the whole of her rebuttal. offered to a boy in an empty back room, and never sent Delmar's way, because Wren had no interest in arguing with anybody. She'd figured out young that arguing was for people who couldn't wait for reality to make the point for them, and Wren could wait. Waiting was the one thing she was better at than anyone in Corriveau County, and the Bottoms, which had been waiting 50 years for somebody to stop fighting them, had finally met their match. The second year she added the wild rice, and this was where the notebook and the winter reading and the long staring at black mud started to look less like a girl playing in the crick and more like something Emil Callahan had glimpsed and never lived to build. Wild rice is not the polished stuff in the grocery bag. It's a native grass that grows in slow, shallow water, 2-3 feet deep, and it had grown in patches in the Choteau bottoms since before anyone's grandfather bought the ground, and every one of those grandfathers had walked past it, cursing it as one more useless thing the water put in his way. Wren had read that certain northern lakes and rivers produced it as a genuine crop, harvested from canoes the old way, hand-parched and worth many times the price of any grain a dry field could grow. And she had stood at the edge of the deepest slough the summer before and looked at the rice already standing there, wild, tall, and green gold and heavy-headed. And she had done the arithmetic in the notebook and then done it again because the first answer seemed too good. That water, the water her family had drowned in, could grow a crop worth more per pound than anything Delmar Boone put in the ground with his tractors and his loans and his 800 dry acres. It could do it with no plowing and no seed cost and no chemicals, because it was already doing it, had been doing it all along, waiting. She did not tell anyone the arithmetic. She got Emil's old flat-bottom boat down from the rafters of the machine shed, where it had hung under a tarp since before she was born, and she and Tobin scraped it and patched 2 seams and painted it with what paint they could find, and she taught herself to pole it through the sloughs, standing up, falling in twice the first week, and coming up laughing the second time, which surprised Tobin, who'd never heard her laugh. When the rice came ripe in the tail of that second summer, she harvested it, the way the book said the old people did it, poling slow through the stands and bending the heads over the gunnel with 2 smooth cedar sticks and knocking the grain loose so it fell into the boat, taking only what was ripe and leaving the green to ripen and reseed so the stand would come back thicker the next year and the year after. It was slow work and beautiful work, and she did most of it alone in the cool of the mornings, with mist coming off the water and the heron standing one-legged and disgusted at being interrupted. And by the time she'd hauled the last boatload up to the shed, she had better than 300 pounds of green rice, which she spread on tarps and turned by hand to dry, and then parched in batches in a cast-iron kettle over a fire in the yard, the way O'Dallas, watching from the porch, said Emil's mother used to parch corn, and which filled the whole hillside with a smell like toasted grass and wood smoke that people on Perot Road would later say they remembered better than anything. Ferris couldn't sell the rice. It was too dear for his little grocery, and the lake people would buy a $2 bunch of cress on a whim, but not a bag of dark, wild grain they didn't know how to cook. So the rice sat, 60-some pounds of it finished and bagged, for most of a month, and it was the first time Wren had made a thing the world didn't immediately want, and she did not panic, because panic was another thing for people who couldn't wait. What she did was drive the rice one Sunday, 40 minutes past Boudry, to a supper club on the far lake called the Heron's Rest, a white tablecloth place run by a chef named Solène Thibodeau, who'd trained in the city and come home to cook for money and quiet. And Wren carried a single bag of the rice into the kitchen through the back door before service and set it on the steel table and asked, would the chef cook a spoonful and taste it? Solène was not a woman who suffered strangers in her kitchen, but there was something in the way the girl stood, patient and unbothered and certain, and something in the smell that rose when Solène opened the bag, and so she simmered a handful in stock while Wren waited by the door, and when she tasted it she went still. "Where does this come from?" she said, and Wren told her the truth she'd been telling all along. The Callahan Bottoms, drowned ground nobody wanted, and Selene bought all 60 pounds on the spot at a price that made Wren keep her face very carefully blank, and asked how much more there'd be next year, and Wren said as much as the water wanted to grow, which Selene would repeat to her customers all that winter as though it were a line of poetry, which in a way it was. That was the year the story stopped being a girl playing in the crick and started being something people told each other. Selene put the rice on the menu at the Heron's Rest as Choteau bottom rice, hand-harvested, and she told the story to every table that ordered it. The girl in the boat and the drowned ground, and the lake people who ate it went home and told the story again. And by the following spring, Wren had orders for the rice before a single head of it had ripened from the Heron's Rest and from 2 other restaurants on the lakes and from a food shop in the city that Selene had put in touch. She'd sold, that third year, better than $4,000 of rice and cress combined, and she'd done it with a flat-bottom boat, 2 cedar sticks, a cast-iron kettle, and a notebook, and without borrowing $1 or plowing an acre or asking anyone's permission. The men at the feed store had stopped laughing by then, though they hadn't yet started saying anything else, because the transition from certain to wrong is a slow one for men like Delmar Boone, and it goes through a long, quiet stretch of saying nothing at all. The turning of Delmar Boone happened in stages, the way such things do, and the first stage was silence. He stopped rendering his verdict at the feed store because the verdict had begun to embarrass itself. He'd drive the county road past the Callahan place slower than he used to, and folks noticed him noticing the tarps of drying rice spread gold in the yard and the tubs of cress washing bright by the pump, and he did not comment, which for Delmar was as loud as a shout. The second stage came the 4th summer, in a July so dry that Delmar's corn curled and his beans went to nothing, and half the dry land farmers in Corriveau County watched a season's loan money bake to dust in the field. Wren's ground did not care. The spring still ran cold under the sloughs, and the water still stood in the rice stands, and while the whole county cracked and dusted, the Callahan bottom stayed green and generous, and it did not escape anyone's notice, least of all Delmar's, that the one piece of ground everybody had cursed for being too wet was the only ground that made money in a drought. That was the summer people started calling it the harvest ground instead of the drowned ground, though nobody could say exactly when the name had turned over. The third stage, the real one, came in October of that 4th year, and it came the way I promised you it would, without Delmar making a large production out of it, because a proud man admitting he was wrong will do almost anything to keep it small. He drove up Perot Road one gray afternoon in his good truck and found Wren at the tubs washing the last cress of the season, and he stood at the edge of the yard with his cap in his hands, a thing Wren had never seen a man do. And he looked at the bottoms a long moment, the way she'd looked at them her first spring, and then he said what he'd come to say. "My grandfather told my father that ground would drown you," he said, "and my father told me, and I told everybody who'd listen, and we were all of us looking at it wrong for the better part of 100 years. He turned the cap in his hands. "I had a low 40 of my own along the river bends," he said, "always cursed it, always tried to drain it, and never could. I was wondering if you'd come look at it and tell me if it's the kind of wet that grows what you grow." And Wren, who could have said a great many things to Delmar Boone and said none of them, wiped her hands on her jeans and looked at him a moment in that way she had, and said she'd come look Tuesday. That was all. He put his cap back on and thanked her and drove off. And neither of them ever mentioned the auction or the certain laugh again, because there was no need. Reality had made the point that no argument could have. She did go look at Delmar's low 40 that Tuesday, and it was good wet, spring-fed along the bends, and she told him honestly what would grow there and how long it would take, and how he should not, under any circumstances, borrow money to do it, because the whole point was that it cost almost nothing to start and everything to hurry. She did not partner with him, and she did not sell him seed, because the rice seeded itself if you let it. And she did not ask for anything but that he'd do it the slow way, the patient way, the way the water wanted. And Delmar, who had spent his whole life doing things the fast way with borrowed money and big machines, listened to a woman not yet 23 tell him to slow down and be patient, and to his lasting credit, did it. Within 3 years, his cursed low 40 was the most reliable income on his whole spread, and he told anyone who'd listen that he'd learned more about farming from watching that girl not hurry than he'd learned in 50 years of hurrying, which was as close to a public apology as a man like Delmar was ever going to get. And it was, coming from him, enormous. The word O'Dallas had planted that October night at the bean shelling had by then rooted all through the county and beyond it. The water is the harvest, Wren had taken to saying, the same 6 words, when the food writer came out from the city to do a piece on the Choteau bottom rice, and when the woman from the university's agriculture extension came to see the operation that everybody was suddenly talking about, and when other folks up and down the river valley, folks who'd cursed their own wet ground for generations, started driving out to Perot Road to ask Wren how you did it. She told them all the same thing, the 6 words, and then the long version, which was that you didn't fight the water, and you didn't drain the water, and you didn't borrow against the water. You learned what the water wanted to grow, and you grew it, and you took only what would grow back, and you let the wanting of people who tasted it pull you forward instead of pushing yourself with debt. Some of them listened, and some of them nodded and went home and tried to drain their bottoms anyway, because old thinking dies hard, but enough of them listened that within a decade there was a scattering of small wild rice operations up and down that stretch of the Vermilion and the Choteau, all of them born out of one girl's notebook and one old woman's offhand sentence. And the food shops in the city started labeling it Valley rice and paying real money for it. And the whole idea of what that drowned country was worth had turned itself completely over. O'Dallas lived to see most of it, which was a mercy, though she never once said she was proud, because O'Dallas did not deal in a currency as cheap as pride. What she did, the fall Wren cleared $10,000 off the rice for the first time, was walk down to the edge of the bottoms with her, slow on her cane, and stand there looking out at the water going gold and rose in the low sun, the herons and the redwings in the mist just starting to rise. And after a long while she said only that Emil would have liked to see this, and Wren said she wished he could have. And O'Dallas said in that flat, economical way of hers that in a manner of speaking he had, because it was his sentence that did it. His water is the harvest that he'd said 1,000 times and never cracked. And Wren realized standing there that the whole thing she'd built had been Emil's idea all along, glimpsed and spoken and buried, and that all she'd done was be the one Callahan patient enough to hear it. She wrote that down that night, too. She kept writing in the notebooks the whole time, one after another, dozens of them by then, and it never occurred to her that they were anything but a working record until the day they turned out to be something more. O'Dallas died in the spring of Wren's 9th year on the ground, quiet, in the white farmhouse, in the room where she'd slept beside Emil for 40 years, and she went the way she'd lived, without fuss and without a lot of words, only asking Wren the evening before to make sure the rice got seeded in the North Slough that year because it had thinned, and Wren promised she would, and it was the last thing O'Dallas ever said to her, a small practical instruction about the ground, which was exactly the right last thing for a woman like that to leave behind. The whole county came to the burying, including Delmar Boone with his cap in his hands, and Ferris Lemoyne, who'd sold the first $4 of cress, and Solène Thibodeau, who cooked the funeral supper out of things that grew in the bottoms, and Tobin Arsenault, grown now and running a rice operation of his own 2 counties over, and it struck Wren, standing at the grave next to the older grave that said Emil Callahan, that she had come to this place a stranger with nowhere else downhill to go, and had somehow, without meaning to and without any plan, become the person the whole valley traced itself back to. She did not feel triumphant about it. She felt the particular ache of having been given something precious by people who were now gone, and of being the one left to carry it. which is its own kind of harvest and its own kind of grief. The Bottomland had one more thing hidden in it, though, and this is the part almost nobody knows, the part that turned Wren's private vindication into something the historians eventually wrote down. Going through Emil's things in the machine shed after Odalis passed, looking for the seed sack she'd promised to fill, Wren found under a bench a metal ammunition box gone to rust at the corners, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, a stack of ledgers in Emil Callahan's cramped hand going back to the 1950s. She sat down on an overturned bucket and read them by the light from the open door, and what she found there stopped her breath. Emil had known, not vaguely, not as a saying he repeated without cracking, but exactly, precisely, in detail. Page after page of his careful notes on the wild rice in the sloughs, which patches produced and which didn't when it ripened, how the old people had parched it, sketches of a knocking stick and a parching kettle, tallies of what a pound might be worth if a man could get it to the right buyer. And in an entry dated the year before he died, a plan, a whole patient plan for harvesting the bottoms the way Wren had spent 9 years working out from scratch, written down in an old man's hand and then, on the last page, abandoned. Too old now, Emil had written, and no one to carry it. And Delmar and the rest would only laugh. So there it sat, and under that, the last line he ever wrote in the ledger, which Wren would have carved on her own headstone if she'd been the carving kind. The water is the harvest, and someday someone in this family will be still enough to hear it. She had been the still one. She had come to the drowned ground with no plan, and had only, in the end, been quiet enough and patient enough and unbothered enough by 50 years of everyone else's certainty to hear a thing her great-uncle had heard and set down and given up on, and the ground had held his knowledge for her the way that black mud had held its richness all those cursed years, waiting. She never expanded the way people expected her to. When the money got large enough that a banker in Beaudry drove out to Perot Road to suggest she buy up the wet ground all along the river and scale the operation into something with her name on trucks, she looked at him the long moment she looked at everything, and she said no, the way she'd said no to nothing her whole life because she'd never needed to, and she told him she'd expand the way she'd done everything else, which was to say slowly, with her own money, letting the wanting of people who tasted the rice pull her forward one slough at a time, and never, not ever, borrowing against water. The banker went home and told people she had no ambition, and he was, like Delmar before him, exactly and completely wrong, because what Wren had was a longer ambition than a banker could measure, an ambition that thought in the terms the mud thought in decades and in richness laid down slow, and it made her, in the fullness of time, wealthier and more respected and more at peace than any man who'd ever laughed at her at a courthouse auction. On the 50th anniversary of the day, her family had first bought and first cursed the Choteau bottoms, though nobody planned it that way. Wren Callahan stood at the edge of her ground on an October morning with a girl beside her, a great niece of her own by then, a quiet, observant child who'd come to stay because there was nowhere else downhill to go, and the girl had her hand out flat toward the water the way you'd hold your hand toward a fire, feeling something come off it. The sun was coming up gold over the rice, and the mist was rising, and the herons were standing disgusted in the shallows, and Wren watched the child study the water in silence a long moment before she spoke, and she recognized the stillness in her, the same stillness Emil had prayed for in his last ledger line, and she felt the whole thing come round like a season. The child asked what they grew down there, and Wren, who was old now herself and economical with words the way the women in that family got, looked out at the drowned ground that had made them and said the 6 words that had come to her from a dead man through a living one across a kitchen table full of beans: the water is the harvest. And the girl looked at the water and looked at her. And after a while she nodded, slow, the way you nod at a thing you don't fully understand yet but know you'll spend your life understanding. And Wren handed her the notebook, the newest of the dozens, still mostly blank, and said, "Write down what you see." And the two of them stood there in the gold light saying nothing, because everything that needed saying had already been said, 50 years before, by a man who'd been too early and too tired, and heard at last by the one still enough to listen. If this story found you at a time when somebody's told you that what you've got, or what you are, or where you come from isn't worth much, I hope you'll pass it along to them, because everybody deserves to hear that the drowned ground is sometimes the richest ground of all, and that patience is a kind of wealth the loud men never learn to count. Tell me down in the comments about something in your own life that people wrote off before you proved them wrong, because those are the stories I most want to read. And let me know what town or what stretch of country you're watching from tonight, whether it's dry land or wet, hill or bottom, because I read every single comment that comes in, and I like knowing where the still ones are. The child's name was Marguerite, though within a week everyone on Perot Road had shortened it to Rhett, and she took to the bottoms the way Wren had taken to them, which is to say, not all at once, and not with any announcement, but slow, going down alone on gray mornings and coming back muddy and thoughtful with the notebook damp in her coat pocket. Wren watched her from the porch and did not instruct her much, because she'd learned from Odalis that the best teaching is mostly withholding, that a person learns a place by being left alone in it long enough to be changed by it. She gave Rhett the flat-bottomed boat, the same one Emil had built and she and Tobin had patched a lifetime ago, now on its third set of new seams, and she showed her the two-seater knocking sticks worn smooth as bone by 3 generations of hands, and she taught her to pole standing up, and the girl fell in exactly twice the way everyone in that family seemed to fall in exactly twice, and came up the second time laughing, and Wren, watching, felt something close a circle in her chest, so gently it was almost like being touched. The harvest that autumn was the best in a decade, and Rhett was there for the whole of it, learning to read the rice heads for ripeness, and to leave the green to reseed, and to take only what would come back. And in the evenings they parched the grain in the cast-iron kettle over the fire in the yard, and the smell of toasted grass and wood smoke went out over the hillside the way it had gone out 50 years running, and people driving Perot Road slowed down to breathe it in the way they always had. Rhett asked, one of those evenings, turning the rice in the kettle with a long wooden paddle, why the men had laughed all those years ago, why anybody would laugh at ground that grew something this good. And Wren looked into the fire a long moment before she answered. Because it looked like nothing, she said, because it was wet and hard, and their fathers had failed at it, and it's easier to call a thing worthless than to be still enough to find out what it's worth. Retta turned the rice and thought about that, and then she asked the question that told Wren the child had already gone deeper into it than most grown people ever did, which was whether it made Wren sad that Emil had known all of it and died before he could do any of it. Wren said it had once. It had nearly broken her heart the day she found the ledgers. But she'd come to see it differently over the years, she told the girl, because a thing known and written down and left for the right person is not the same as a thing wasted. Emil had done his part, which was to see it and set it down and trust that someday somebody in the family would be quiet enough to hear. She'd done hers, which was to be that somebody. And now, she said, looking at Retta across the fire, there was another part coming, and it wasn't hers anymore. She gave the ledgers to Retta that winter, the rusted ammunition box and the oilcloth and all of it, Emil's cramped hand and her own dozens of notebooks stacked beside them. And she told the girl that the whole of what she needed to know was in there, 3 generations of watching the same water, and that her job was not to change it, but to add to it, one more hand in the long relay of hands, Rhett read the ledgers by the wood stove all that cold season, the way Wren had read them by the light from the shed door, and she came to understand, as Wren had, that the 6 words were not a slogan but an instruction, and that the instruction was mostly about patience, which is the hardest thing in the world to teach a young person and the only thing worth teaching. The Valley rice was famous now, or as famous as a thing like that gets, sold in city shops, with the story printed on the bag, cooked in restaurants 2 states over, taught about at the university where Professor Wren had never met, used the Choteau bottoms as a case study in what she called working with the grain of the land. None of it had made Wren loud. She still washed her own cress when the season came, still poled her own stretch of slough on the mornings her hips allowed it, still said no to bankers and to buyers who wanted more than the water wanted to give, and the operation stayed small the way she'd kept it small her whole life, small and deep and rich, the way the mud itself was rich, and Retta, watching her, was learning that there were kinds of bigness a person could refuse and be the greater for refusing. Delmar Boone had died 2 winters before, an old man reconciled to his cursed low 40 at last, and he'd left instructions that surprised the whole county, which were that his Riverbend ground, the wet 40 Wren had walked with him that Tuesday so many years back, should go to Wren Callahan for the price of $1, the same price she'd paid for her own drowned acres, and a note that said only, in a hand as plain as the man himself, "You were right and I was wrong, and I never made a big enough thing of saying so." Wren had bought it for the $1 and had not farmed it hard, only let the rice seed in and the water do its work, and now she walked it sometimes with Retta and told the girl the story of the auction and the certain laugh, not with any bitterness, because the bitterness had gone out of it decades ago, but as a lesson in how a proud man could turn if reality was patient enough with him. The $1 bill, Delmar's note, had been folded around. Wren kept in the coffee can, the same coffee can she'd counted her $60 out of at the courthouse, and she showed it to Rhett one day and told her to keep it after she was gone, not for the money, which was nothing, but for the reminder that worth and price are 2 different things, and that the whole valley had spent a century confusing them. She was very old the last spring, and she knew it the way Odalis had known it, without alarm, and she asked Retta one evening on the porch to make sure the rice got seeded in the north slough that year, because it had thinned, and Retta, who had read the ledgers and knew what that instruction had been the last time, felt her throat close, and promised she would. It was near enough to the last thing Wren said to her, a small practical instruction about the ground, the right last thing for a woman in that family to leave behind, and when Wren was buried, it was in the row with Emil and Odalis above the bottoms, and the whole valley came, the grown children of people who'd laughed and the grown children of people who'd learned, and Solène Thibodeau's granddaughter cooked the supper out of things that grew in the water, and Rhett went down to the North Slough that autumn alone in the old flat-bottom boat, and she seeded the rice the way she'd been shown, and she took only what would come back. And in the gold light with the mist rising and the heron standing disgusted in the shallows, she opened the newest notebook to the first blank page and wrote down what she saw. And under it, because it was true and because it was hers now to carry, she wrote the 6 words, "The water is the harvest." And she meant standing there, to be still enough to hear it, the way the still ones in that family always had, across all the years, waiting.